You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. How did we get to the point where millions of Americans live just one crisis away from poverty, while billionaires get richer every year? Last week, I looked at some of the racist historical policies that stripped families of generational wealth.
If a white person dared rent to a Black person, people would be so upset, they would literally throw firebombs into the home.
Today, we'll look at the impact of those policies and the long campaign to disempower all American workers.
It began to be perceived, particularly by the right wing, oh, labor unions have too much power. We need to kind of clip their wings. They're holding us hostage.
I'm Sylvie Sturm. This is Civic. When we take a look at the massive wealth gap between the rich and poor in this country, what stands out most is how differently it affects the country's white and Black populations. According to data from the Federal Reserve Board's Survey of Consumer Finances, the typical Black family has $24,000 in wealth. This is less than 13% of the $190,000 in wealth owned by the typical white family. This racial wealth gap is rooted in a long history of racist policies. As we talked about in the last episode, the 1930s Great Depression brought on progressive policies to mitigate inequality. New Deal programs like the GI Bill helped millions of veterans secure housing by promoting home ownership through a federal agency that backed loans and guaranteed mortgages. A 1944 public service announcement from the Army Information Branch advertised the GI Bill of Rights Servicemen's Readjustment Act.
As soon as he got out of the Navy, he applied to the Director of Finance, Veterans Administration in Washington, and they were able to help him get a loan by guaranteeing it up to $2,000. Of course, George, like every veteran, had to meet certain conditions, prove he was a reliable citizen, but he was able to do that all right. The GI Bill of Rights is not a reward or a handout or a gravy train, but rather an American way to make it easier for each man to take his place once again in the community and get some of those things for which he went to war: a job, a business, an education, a home.
The federal agency in charge of the program decided who qualified for a loan, and the vast majority of Black Americans did not qualify. Venice Wagner, a San Francisco State University journalism professor, explains.
What this agency did was they created maps around the country of various cities. And in these maps, they designated homes that would be viable for this mortgage program. And if the area was Black, then it was considered blighted.
Racist covenants on residential properties also barred people of color from renting or owning a home in certain neighborhoods.
If a white person dared rent to a Black person, or if a white person dared to sell a home, then they basically were subject to white mob violence. People would be so upset, they would literally throw firebombs into the home to scare them. They would write threatening notes saying, "You better get out of here or we're gonna, kill you."
Those covenants were codified into law in a practice that's now referred to as redlining. It all started in the 1930s during the housing crisis of the Great Depression. That's when real estate moguls laid the groundwork for the National Housing Act of 1934. As Think TV on PBS explains, from this, a new federal agency was formed.
The Homeowners Loan Corporation, and with it, residential security maps that became the standard to determine the best places for housing investments. White communities with strong racially restricted deeds were given a grade A rating and identified as desirable for lending purposes, while Black communities, regardless of their economic status, were given a grade D rating and branded as hazardous and high risk. No federally backed loans would be made there. Redlining locked out millions of Americans from accessing mortgages and stunted opportunities for Black families to build wealth to pass down to future generations.
There are areas here in the Bay Area, like if you look at the old redlining maps, if you juxtapose those maps on top of a current map, you will see that the legacy of that discrimination of the access to ranking policy is still impacting communities today. Like, you can juxtapose them and see the areas of distress that remain today.
The impact of so many blocked opportunities is apparent in Wagner's family to this day.
There's like very little wealth in my family. I'm probably the only person who owns a condo in my family, who has a mortgage. My mother and father don't, my brother doesn't, my other brother doesn't, my sister doesn't, my grandfather's other daughter, she had a mortgage for a short while with the help of her brother, but that ended up in smoke through predatory lending.
Deceptive scheming among financial institutions enticed subprime borrowers with extremely low teaser mortgage rates. After a grace period, interest rates skyrocketed. Borrowers were left with monthly repayments they couldn't afford, and because appraisers were in a booming real estate market, they routinely overvalued homes. So loans were far more than the houses were actually worth. That predatory lending led up to the subprime mortgage crisis of 2007 to 2009. That's when the bottom 90% of Americans saw a third of their wealth wiped out. And there's a direct correlation between the people who were targeted with predatory lending schemes and redlining practices.
If you were to, for example, look at the redlining maps and look at the area where subprime loans were primarily targeted, you would see they were targeted in formerly redlined communities. So all I can say is that history keeps repeating itself.
Derek Sue is among the vast number of Americans wiped out by the subprime mortgage crisis. He lives in a city-sanctioned homeless encampment in Oakland.
What caused me to become homeless back in 2008 was the collapse of the real estate market. I already knew I was going to lose my home, but then trying to find a home during a recession and also a huge downturn in available housing units, because now all of a sudden apartments became extremely expensive and I had no income.
We spoke to him last week about the generational wealth that was stripped away from him when the government went after his great-grandfather's successful businesses. Later on, his family also suffered from racist covenants that excluded non-whites from certain neighborhoods. He vividly remembers one incident that happened when he was just 4 years old.
In 1964, my mother, she was an employee for Macy's, and her boss, actually the president or CEO of the San Francisco Macy's at the time, he put out invitations to his best employees to come to his home for Christmas. Problem was, in the 60s, there was still a lot of areas that people of color could not go. And this person, the CEO, lived in Piedmont. That was an area that was still off limits to Chinese people or people of color. It was a white-only city. So when we went to the party, we brought the invitation. I was 4 years old at the time, looking forward to it. Obviously, you have a family, you can have a station wagon back then, and we crossed over the Piedmont border, and within 4 blocks, a Piedmont police officer had his lights on us and pulling us over. Once my dad pulled over, lowered the window, started talking to the officer. Officer was very rude, number one, and making a lot of racial comments about our race not being allowed in that city, and were we too stupid or didn't read and understand English. And then when my dad was allowed to speak, he said, "We're here for a party, and I have an invitation to show you." And so the officer, giving an attitude, "Let me see that." So he took the invitation, looked at it, saw that it was just up the street, and told my father, "Go straight to that address. I want to have a talk with that owner." And so we did exactly that, and the police officer went to the owner of the home, which was the CEO of Macy's, and the CEO essentially told the cop to go screw himself, that they were his guests and to not harass his guests.
So as a 4-year-old sitting in the back of the station wagon, what do you remember how you felt, what you were thinking?
Oh, I was terrified. I'm scared because you have a Caucasian cop with a gun, a badge, and the authority to do whatever he wanted, pretty much. If he wanted to shoot us up there for, he could probably do it back then. He could probably have killed every one of us and said we were trespassing in a all-white city.
Today, we see that wealth inequality is most acute among people of color. Since 2005, African Americans and Latinos have made up about 60% of all people in the lowest income families, but they make up just 40% of the total population. NYU sociology professor Patrick Sharkey talked about his research on multi-generational disadvantage in an online lecture for the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality.
Once we begin to think about inequality over generations, as opposed to snapshots of an individual's life, then we start to get a very different picture about the consequences of living in a poor neighborhood. Where we go to school, the quality of the air we breathe, the social networks that we form, types of economic opportunities available to us. All of these things come bundled in space and affect the life chances of everyone that lives within a particular neighborhood. The racial inequality that we see today when we look at where African American and white families live right now, is really a continuation of inequality that's been passed down across generations. About half of African American families have lived in the poorest quarter of neighborhoods, American neighborhoods, not just right now, not just in a single generation, but over consecutive generations. When we look at whites, this is extremely rare. Only about 7% of white families live in poor neighborhoods over multiple generations. If we just look at those families that are currently living in poor neighborhoods, about 80% of African American children living in a poor neighborhood now are from families that have lived in similarly poor neighborhoods for at least 2 generations. And that's compared to about half of white families. So what that means is that children that are currently exposed to poor neighborhoods are from families that have experienced the same disadvantages that come bundled up in a neighborhood over long periods of time.
After World War II, the country's economy had bounced back despite freezing out most non-white Americans. The spread of wealth became more balanced thanks in large part to income tax. By 1944, the top marginal tax rate was 94% on all income over $200,000. That's $3.2 million in today's dollars. There's wealth to be made, and the population wanted a piece of it. Diane Fry is a labor studies professor at SF State University. She recently co-edited and contributed to a textbook called Human Rights and Economic Inequalities.
After World War II, people had sacrificed for so long during the war. People hadn't been able to buy things. It was really a very disciplined kind of economy to help the U.S. win that war. And there was a lot of pent-up demand of people coming back and saying, okay, we've worked this hard. We want a piece of the American dream. We want to have a nice house. We want to be able to buy a car. And so there was kind of enhanced labor militancy following World War II. And part of that was massive strikes, a couple of really significant strikes.
Efforts of business interests to forcibly open the strike-paralyzed port of San Francisco failed. Open warfare rages through the streets of the city as 3,000 Union pickets battle 700 police.
It began to be perceived, particularly by the right wing, oh, labor unions have too much power. We need to kind of clip their wings. They're holding us hostage. We need to try to really take back some of the rights that were given in the original National Labor Relations Act. And that was the whole battle over Taft-Hartley, which basically kind of rolls back protections in the original National Labor Relations Act.
In 1947, the president, Harry Truman, spoke out about the evils of the bill.
But the Taft-Hartley bill is a shocking piece of legislation. The bill is deliberately designed to weaken labor unions. When the sponsors of this bill claim that by weakening unions, they are giving rights back to individual working men, they ignore the basic reason why unions are important in our democracy. Unions exist so that laboring men can bargain with their employers on a basis of equality. Because of unions, the living standards of our working people have increased steadily until they are today the highest in the world. A bill which would weaken unions would undermine our national policy of collective bargaining. A Taft-Hartley bill would do just that. It would take us back in the direction of the old evils of individual bargaining. It would take the bargaining power away from the workers and give more power to management.
He tried to veto it, but failed.
It allowed employers to begin to campaign against union election efforts. And so we see the whole rise of union busting law firms and kind of the social science, social psychology of union busting.
By the time Truman left office 10 years later, the nation had an almost 20% poverty rate. So when President Lyndon Johnson was elected in 1963, the focus wasn't on empowering corporations. Johnson had a different take on government priorities.
The job of government is to make sure everybody has a job. And if we can make sure people have jobs and decent wages and salaries, then that demand is going to allow an economy to keep growing and to be healthy.
Johnson vowed to wage war on poverty during his 1964 State of the Union address.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. And I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort. It will not be a short or easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice, but we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it. Poverty is a national problem, requiring improved national organization and support to help that 1/5 of all American families with incomes too small to even meet their basic needs. Our chief weapons in a more pinpointed attack will be better schools and better health and better homes and better training and better job opportunities to help more Americans, especially young Americans, escape from squalor and misery.
But the notion that the American government should help the most vulnerable portion of the population began eroding in the 1970s during rampant inflation and an oil shock. A WPIX story from June 1979 reported on gas rationing and how New Yorkers were coping.
Some of the people online here have been in other lines and still don't have a tank of gas.
I've been in 2 gas lines already.
This morning?
This morning.
How long did you wait for the first one?
I've been in both lines over an hour, and I'm out of gas. Dead out.
And that was an opportunity kind of for the liberals to kind of go back to their, hey, what about freedom? What about each individual is responsible for themselves? And so we get kind of the rise of neoliberalism. Making life better actually really makes life hell. Like there's some kind of famous things. They were always there. But in the 1980s, their kind of philosophy, their ideology really found more support in the UK through Margaret Thatcher, in the United States through Ronald Reagan.
This country was founded on faith in the individual, not groups or classes, but faith in the resources and bounty of each and every separate human soul. Our founding fathers designed a democratic form of government to enlist the individual's energies and fashioned a Bill of Rights to protect its freedoms. We protect the freedom of expression of the author, as we should. But what of the freedom of expression of the entrepreneur, whose pen and paper are capital and profits, whose book may be a new invention or small business?
And so the role of government once again shifted away from helping average Americans to helping businesses with massive tax cuts.
When I sign this bill into law, America will have the lowest marginal tax rates and the most modern tax code among major industrialized nations, one that encourages risk-taking, innovation, and that old American spirit of enterprise.
I remember watching when I was really young, when he was nominated, he was at the convention. And I was with friends and we were like, this is crazy. Like, this can't be. And, we were just kind of beginning life and thinking that, life is going to be a progression of what we've seen in the 60s and 70s. And so we're going to continue to grow a social safety net and have a just society. And we think that that's going to be our continued trajectory. And basically, for people of my generation, we spent our entire adult lives post-Reagan. So it's not the United States, not the life, not what we thought we were going to be able to do. So it's just shocking.
My first act as chief executive will be to impose an immediate and thorough freeze on federal hiring. Then we're going to enlist the very best minds from business, labor, and whatever quarter, to conduct a detailed review of every department, bureau, and agency that lives by federal appropriation. Our instructions to the groups we enlist will be simple and direct. We will remind them that government programs exist at the sufferance of the American taxpayer and are paid for with money earned by working men and women, and programs that represent a waste of their money, a theft from their pocketbooks, must have that waste eliminated or that program must go.
Basically, you see the turn that government isn't the source of solutions. Government is not the source of resources to make lives better. Government is the leech that takes money out of your pocket. And we can do much better if we privatize everything, because if there's a private profit at stake, we will get things the absolute most efficiently that can possibly happen. And so I think that filtered through all of the federal government in terms of rolling back federal programs, questioning every kind of expenditure, questioning where services are going to come from, and basically making the government itself the enemy.
I think you all know that I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
And we still live with that vestige.
Reagan advocated policies that transfer economic control from the public to the private sector. We saw this when he reversed the power of public labor unions in 1981. That's when he fired 11,000 striking air traffic controllers.
I must tell those who failed to report for duty this morning, they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
Over the next decade, union membership went from about a third of the American workforce to around 10% at the end of the Reagan-Bush presidencies. Disempowering unions had a huge impact on widening the wealth gap. Professor of sociology Bruce Western talked about it during a lecture for the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality.
We're really fortunate to have survey data across the whole population from 1972 to today. Now, a lot of different things explain the growth of inequality in America: globalization, immigration, education. We found that deunionization explains about a third of the growth in inequality for men and about a fifth of the growth in inequality for women. Non-union employers were often looking at unionised firms to figure out what their wages should be in order to be competitive. And this means that the wages of non-union workers were also influenced by the presence of unions in the labour market. We saw then that the effects of unions were very broad. They extended well beyond the workplaces they were organising. And this was because they exerted this effect in politics, keeping alive the political conversation about equity among workers. And they had this cultural effect. So there were norms in the labour market in which people had beliefs about what a fair level of wages should be and what a fair distribution of wages should look like.
Reagan also raised taxes on working-class people 11 times, and he started the trend of jacking up the cost of education, which today is so high that an entire generation is saddled with more than $1.5 trillion in student debt. Reagan did this so he could afford a massive income tax cut for millionaires and multimillionaires, which went from 74% to 25%. There were no billionaires in America then, in large part because of previous tax policies. But after tax cuts on the rich by Reagan and then Presidents George W. Bush and Donald Trump, that's when the country began seeing an explosion of billionaires. Meanwhile, median and minimum wages plunged faster than they had since the Great Depression. This is also when the political ideology shifted from describing poverty as a social problem to describing it as a personal problem. Here again is Diane Fry.
Neoliberalism isn't the same everywhere. It doesn't come through the same methods or mechanisms, but it all rests on the idea that, if people are poor, it's basically their fault.
We have found in this country, and maybe we're more aware of it now, is one problem that we've had even in the best of times, and that is the people who are sleeping on the grates, the homeless who are homeless, you might say, by choice.
So there's a way that it really is kind of insidiously internalized. The fact that we have inequality is a good thing, because inequality makes sure that the best are going to rise, and eventually, because we have inequality, the economy is going to grow, and that's going to allow money to trickle down to the people who aren't doing so well.
Public policy professor and former U.S. Secretary of Labor Robert Reich talks about the impact of Reagan's trickle-down theory for inequality media.
2 years before Ronald Reagan's first tax cut, the richest 1% of Americans owned less than 23% of the nation's wealth. A decade later, after 2 rounds of tax cuts for the rich, they owned over 28%. By 2019, after more tax cuts for the rich by George W. Bush and Donald Trump, people at the top owned almost 35% of America's wealth. Meanwhile, average wealth barely budged for the middle class and went negative for the bottom 10%.
Nevertheless, Reagan was so successful in shaping the narrative that we still use similar language today.
It's why everybody wants to be rich. And it's been internalized in such a way that even in the progressive community, I think we don't realize the way that our thinking has been basically marketized. We talk about investing in youth rather than, the decent lives and aspirations and human dignity of all people.
Claiming government was the problem, not the solution, became such a popular talking point by the 1990s that even Democrat Bill Clinton ran for president using a similar theme. Here's his campaign ad from 1992.
For so long, government has failed us, and one of its worst failures has been welfare. I have a plan to end welfare as we know it, to break the cycle of welfare dependency. We'll provide education, job training, and child care, but then those who are able must go to work, either in the private sector or in public service. I know it can work. In my state, we've moved 17,000 people from welfare rolls to payrolls. It's time to make welfare what it should be, a second chance, not a way of life.
Clinton did gut welfare despite outcries from his own party. Opponents argued that punitive and unnecessary rules blocked beneficiaries from improving their circumstances. For example, adults couldn't get an advanced education because they had to spend so much time working or volunteering to continue receiving benefits. Top Democratic Party leaders continued to promote the notion of limited government for the next 2 decades. Here's President Barack Obama during his 2012 State of the Union address.
I'm a Democrat, but I believe what Republican Abraham Lincoln believed. The government should do for people only what they cannot do better by themselves and no more.
This was an era when the pro-free market drumbeat really caught hold, thanks to right-wing radio hosts. As Politico reported in 2014, conservatives backing the Tea Party spent nearly $22 million between 2008 and 2012 on influential talkers like Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, and, of course, this guy.
Rush Limbaugh, thank you for your decades of tireless devotion to our country. I am proud to announce tonight that you will be receiving our country's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
By 2016, Trump was emboldened to launch a full-on assault on labor unions. The PBS NewsHour reported that Trump marked Labor Day that year by attacking the head of America's biggest labor union.
The president said AFL-CIO Chief Richard Trumka spoke so against the working men and women of our country and the success of the U.S. itself that it's easy to see why unions are doing so poorly. Trumka had criticized the president's strategy for renegotiating NAFTA. White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor now takes a look at the Trump administration and labor unions.
First, the president issued executive orders limiting the activities of the unions that represent them. About a week ago, a federal judge blocked that action. Then, last week, President Trump issued a notice to Congress, eliminating a potential pay hike for federal employees. That action is also expected to wind up in court.
Recently, though, American workers have been taking their power back. In one of the biggest victories for organized labor in a generation, Amazon workers defied the company's powerful anti-union campaigning to form a union on Staten Island. And as the pandemic toppled the traditional workforce, there's been a fundamental shift in the American working culture. Workers across thousands of different industries have been holding strikes across the country. Here's Elena Samuels, senior economics correspondent for Time on CNBC.
You've seen for 20 years or so, workers lose a lot of bargaining power. And finally, the economy is getting a little better. The unemployment rate is falling. There are a lot of job openings. And they're saying, you know what, I don't want to put up with this anymore. Unions still represent a pretty small share of the workforce, but you see unions gaining a little bit of power over even workplaces that they don't organize. So if unions are going to bring up wages in one sector, maybe another hospital nearby will also have to bring up wages. So even though they aren't that big of a deal in a lot of workplaces now, they still have some power. And people are beginning to say, you know what, maybe those unions actually were right. Maybe we deserve a little bit more.
A new tone was set in the Oval Office with the election of President Joe Biden. He's endorsed a major tax increase on accumulated wealth that would target the top 0.01% of households. In March, he proposed a billionaire minimum income tax, a 20% minimum tax on households worth more than $100 million. Here's Diane Fry again.
I'm up in Vermont, so it's very relaxed here, and you get a lot of time to sit and look at the lake and think about things. And I think that as I kind of step back, what I think is there's a fundamental question of, does an economy and a society work for people, or do people work for the economy and the society? And I think the economy and the society should work to enhance the quality of our lives, that we're not here to enhance the quality of Jeff Bezos or, any other billionaire's life.
But the ultra-wealthy always have a way to pass immense fortunes to their heirs without paying any estate tax. Currently, they're exploiting a loophole that lets them quickly churn assets in and out of trusts to make inheritances look smaller than they really are. That grift has cost the U.S. Treasury an estimated $100 billion over the past 13 years. This also serves to fuel inequality.
When people see that we can't really grow our way out of this, then the only thing that's left is redistribution. That is the only solution, that we can't have everybody having nothing and a few folks having everything. My hope is that it's going to be increasingly challenged. In the United States, I think we see promising signs, at least, of wanting to shift more tax burden back to where it was a few years ago, where corporations and wealthy individuals paid more. But I think it's going to be a struggle. And again, it goes back to power, because if you have all the wealth, you don't want to give it up. And so you're going to use all of your resources. And if you're Jeff Bezos, you have more resources than anybody, and your chances of winning are pretty good, So I think that it's really a battle.
I'm Sylvie Sturm, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic is produced by KSFP-LP, a project of the San Francisco Public Press. Our team includes producer Leanna Wilcox and contributor Mel Baker, who's also program director for KSFP. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Thanks for listening.